In this video, Educational Psychology in Your Music Classroom, we will be discussing developmental theories, social influences, learning theories, motivation, special needs, and assessment. We will talk about what these theories and topics mean to music teachers and how to apply what we've learned to the classroom. Many people claim that they learn best through a certain learning style. Many teachers even administrate quizzes to help students determine whether they are auditory, visual, or kinesthetic learners. Since most information is stored completely separately from sensory details, there is no way that the information learned could be performed better through a particular learning style. This can limit a student's learning because they will be less likely to try and learn in new ways. A student's genes affect their development, and so does a student's family, community, and culture. Famous theorist Jean Piaget concluded that when students learned based off of their previous experiences, they are attempting to create equilibrium with the information they are given. Students essentially take the information that is presently being given and either assimilate the new information and use an existing schema, or accommodate it by modifying or creating a new schema. Lev Vygotsky's sociocultural theory informs us that in between the stages of performing a task all by oneself and tasks one cannot do even with help, there is a zone of proximal development. Within this zone, students can complete and learn tasks with others who may be more competent on the subject. Make sure you educate your students about learning styles. If a student claims they can only learn information by listening to a rhythm, challenge their opinion on the subject and encourage them to try learning to feel the rhythm in their hands or feet. If you use all learning styles in the classroom, this will be less of an issue. It's also important to get to know a student beyond the classroom. Being informed of a student's culture, who their parents or guardians are, what kind of community they're growing up in, can be so helpful into understanding how these elements of their life affect them developmentally. Knowing these things can give you insight as to any difficulties this child may be facing, and hopefully give you a team of people in that student's life who are able to help that child succeed. Knowing the student's prior musical knowledge is important to understanding the scheme students are either assimilating or accommodating towards. Knowing what information your students have already explored will make the transition of new information smoother for the students and more relevant for them. This leads me to the next thing, which is scaffolding. The point of scaffolding is to build a construct of knowledge in a way that makes sense. By starting with the basics and slowly working up to a perfected craft, the learning experience will be smooth and without holes. During this learning process, there will be times where group work comes in, meaning you aren't ready to test students on their knowledge on their own, but they have a good handle on the information. Finding this zone of proximity is part of the process, and informing students about how to break down information is helpful to the learner. People have 5 personality traits: openness, which means you're curious, creative, comfortable with new experiencing things and ideas; conscientiousness, which means you're organized and self-disciplined; extroversion, which usually means you're energetic and socially outgoing; agreeableness, which means you're trusting, generous, cooperative in social situations; and neuroticism, which means you're prone to negative emotions and you have low tolerance for stress. When a child is between the ages of 10 and 14, they experience a drop in self-esteem, are able to think about how others think about them, and often think that others are thinking about them, which is their sense of imaginary audience. Early adolescents also often believe in a personal fable, which means they think that they're unlike anyone else, and they can't be understood by others. Culture is defined as the behaviors and belief systems of a social group. These can be determined by participation in cultural activities. There will be students from all backgrounds in your classroom, and some may be facing challenges that make the classroom experience difficult, to say the least. Being aware of possible difficulty with acculturation is extremely important. There is little evidence that biological differences actually affect ability, and yet a gender gap, race gap, and socioeconomic status gap proves that stereotypes are still affecting the education system and its students. Stereotype threat is defined as students becoming overly anxious in domains in which their group stereotypically does poorly, and as a result, perform more poorly than they otherwise would. Research shows that the presence of stereotype threat affects students' achievement. Know that an adaptable, self-disciplined, outgoing personality tends to be most resilient. Also be aware that personalities are oftentimes on a spectrum, and being comfortable in an environment can influence how outgoing a person is. Getting to know your student is a good way to get a feel for their personalities. Knowing their personalities will help you determine how to assist them socially. For instance, if you notice a student is highly neurotic and prone to negative emotions, that is something to be aware of. If there's ever a high-stress situation that they are involved with, like performing a solo, for instance. We build our identity from our own successes and failures, which means that negative experiences can cause negative self-efficacy. Sometimes musical opportunities can lead to embarrassment. Creating a safe environment where your students feel supported in their solo work will make it easier for students to sing or play instruments without the concept of failure. Adolescence is also very aware of others and compares themselves often. Making sure auditions don't lead to a lot of competitiveness is important at this age, and making all students feel a part of the group will also make finding their identity a supported journey. It is important to be sensitive to the many cultures in your classroom, but it is also important to understand that race does not define culture. The best way to know and understand a student's culture is to know them personally. Icebreakers and social activities is a good way to do this. Also make sure that you know the parents of these students. Don't jump to conclusions that a student is struggling because of their culture. It's important to understand our own biases as teachers within Western culture and how that could affect our teaching. When you know a student is dealing with acculturation, or when a student's home life conflicts with school culture, being prepared to help that student is so important. Incorporate teachings of many cultures into your classrooms. Gloria Ladson-Billings said, "If teachers pretend not to see students as racial and ethnic differences, they really do not see the students at all, and are limited in their ability to meet their educational needs." ReducingStereotypeThreat.org suggests combating stereotype threat by having high expectations with optimism about the student's potential, especially during criticism, role models that go against a stereotype, education about stereotype threat, reassuring the students about anxiety, initial difficulty, mistakes, explicitly going against stereotypes, and emphasize effort instead of intelligence or ability for improvement. Cognitive theory is the internal mental process, how people perceive, interpret, manipulate, and remember information. In terms of remembering information, memory has 3 components: the sensory register, working memory, and long-term memory. The working memory is the information that you are actively thinking about. Long-term memory involves retrieval and how well information was encoded in the brain. Encoding information is when a lasting physical change affected the brain. Behaviorism is how the immediate environment affects behavior and how people learn to change behavior based on consequences. Social cognitive theory includes behaviors and personal beliefs that are influenced by observing and imitating other people. Moving up the pyramid on Bloom's taxonomy requires using or transferring previous knowledge in more difficult situations. Bloom's taxonomy also brings up the concept of metacognition, which is the idea that a student understands their own understanding or a way of reaching understanding. Using Bloom's taxonomy helps educators see the pathway students go through to get to creating. Making factual knowledge automatic can cheat the working memory. Working on automaticity for factual information and chunking information will make retrieving information easier and less complicated when performing a task. An example of this is when students memorize note values based on the symbol they're seeing. Elaboration, organization, and visual imagery creates pathways to finding that information, makes memory stronger, and therefore easier for individuals to retrieve information that is encoded. Classical and instrumental conditioning are two different ways to go about handling behavior in the classroom. A common example of classical conditioning is Pavlov's dogs. The way we can translate this into the classroom by creating cues for our students to respond to for certain classroom situations. For instance, to clean up the classroom, you could teach a cleanup song. Every time you start singing the cleanup song, the students would eventually learn to begin to clean up. Instrumental conditioning involves consequences and even punishment when a student does something incorrectly. Modeling is a very effective way to assist in a student in a social cognitive sense. Choosing or voting on a choir or band president and section leaders gives the students a good role model. Someone who is competent at a behavior or skill, prestige or status, exhibits behaviors relevant to the learner are all good models. A student's self-efficacy is determined how likely they feel they can succeed. Being aware of that past success or failure, their current emotional state, expectations from others, and group successes all affect self-efficacy. It's important to know that when choosing non-competitive activities, which can be hard to do in the music classroom. Attempting to allow students to try a lot of different things within the music room and the performance aspect will build their confidence and allow them to explore the parts of music performance they enjoy, raising their self-efficacy and making them more engaged in your classroom. The four basic needs include arousal or stimulation, which is the need for either physical or cognitive stimulation, competence and self-worth, which is the need to think about yourself positively, self-determination, which is the desire for autonomy and self-direction regarding the things you do and the course life takes, and relatedness is the need to feel socially connected and to secure the love and respect of others. Expectancy is the belief about the likelihood of succeeding. Value is the extent to which an activity has direct or indirect benefits. This value is based off of how important it is, the utility of it, which means how much it relates to your external goal, and if it's enjoyable. The cost is the value worth the time and effort that this will take? The achievement goal theory indicates that there are three types of goal seekers in your classroom. There are those who are going for a mastery goal, which is optimal, and this is best for encouraging learning because it's desire to acquire new knowledge or master new skills. There's performance approach goal, which is sort of a mixed bag, and it's the desire to look good in the eyes of others. And then there's the performance avoidance goal, which is the desire to avoid looking bad in the eyes of others and avoid unfavorable judgments. And this is sort of the negative choice, and it leads to avoiding challenges and anxiety. Attribution theory has to do with the fact that when we succeed or fail, we make attributions about the reasons or causes of our successes and our failures. Students are often motivated by intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. When a student is extrinsically motivated, the task is usually a means to an end. Usually it is easy to determine if someone is intrinsically motivated, because they are motivated by something that is determined by their own achievement and understanding or mastery of a skill, and therefore it is better for students to be intrinsically motivated. Sometimes extrinsic motivators like grades can assist in good ways too. Motivators like a musical performance is a good way to increase good intrinsic motivation. Also remember the 4 basic needs for determining motivation. Self-efficacy is the expectancy that student feels they will succeed. Being supportive of your students and their achievements will keep them going. Announce to the class when a student has been a part of a music competition. Give students opportunities to perform. Try to create a classroom based on positivity and effort, and less on competition. Special needs includes mental and learning disabilities, emotional and behavioral disabilities, physical disabilities, and invisible chronic illnesses. The most important thing to remember is that each person should be responded to in an individualized way. Don't assume you know everything about a student who may have a certain need. As there is a continuum of disability and high ability, this is also a good time to point out that even though a person may have issues in one area, this doesn't mean that the student cannot be highly skilled in another area. IEP stands for Individualized Education Program. According to understood.org, it spells out your child's learning needs, the services the school will provide, and how progress will be measured. Several people, including parents, are involved in creating the document. The entire process will be a great way to sort out your child's strengths and weaknesses, and working on an IEP can help you figure out what ways you can help him or her succeed in school. Using the correct language in the school and classroom is important when being sensitive to those students enrolled in the special education program. Always using person-first language is an example of this. Be creative in the possibilities for all students and what they are capable of. Being well-versed in a student's IEP is also important. Another important thing to remember is that a lot of the accommodations instructors can include in the classroom are oftentimes very helpful for all students and are good habits to start getting into regardless of who is in your classroom. Things like being thorough with directions, breaking down steps, and giving all students opportunities and assignments based on their own needs are very useful strategies. To learn more about special education, please get informed by doing some research. Please see the websites listed. Good assessments have reliability, which means assessments give consistent information about a student. They have standardization, which means they're similar in format, content, and evaluation criteria for everyone. They're valid, which means they measure what is intended to measure and accurately represents curriculum and instructional goals, and they're practical, which means they're easy to use. To create a well-rounded assessment, it is important to master basic facts and skills, lower-level cognitive processes, and also use what we learn in new situations. Then work our way up to higher-level cognitive processes, and this is where we look at Bloom's taxonomy, which is a very good map on how to do this and where we're really going with our knowledge. When making an assessment, make the criteria explicit in advance. Define expectations clearly, use a rubric with specific criteria, strive for objectivity, assess frequently, give opportunities to correct, revise, or retake, and give supportive, positive, and negative feedback. And when you're grading throughout your entire curriculum, think deeply about your criteria and how you will grade it. Think about grading for improvement, and think about grading for effort. Will you give extra credit? What will you do with lateness and missing work? How many graded assignments will you have? Will you allow retakes and revisions? And what were the prior expectations for these students? This concludes Educational Psychology in the Music Classroom. Thank you for watching.